Good evening, everyone. How are you doing today? Wonderful. Welcome to Arena Stage. My name is Renee Littleton. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications here, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's Arena Civil Dialogues presented by Exelon. The Arena Civil Dialogues, created and led by Professor Amitai Etzioni, is all about creating conversations with those of us in the Washington, D.C. community, engaging in a civil discourse about different issues, social and political. It's also an opportunity to demonstrate that even though we may have differing viewpoints, we can get together in a room and have a really great conversation and walk out still liking each other at the end. So without further ado, I welcome you all to this evening's Civil Dialogues of Reform and Revolution. Thank you and have a great evening.
Well, thank you very much for introductory comments. Indeed, this is our 11th getting together, and so far they have been all very civil, including the evening we had Trump supporters and Trump opponents here. And those of you who missed some of our previous occasions can find them both on YouTube and on our inner stage under Civil Dialogues. And I have not the slightest doubt in my mind will not disappoint you tonight, both in terms of having a vigorous discussion and a civil one. So I'm just going to say a few words to get us on our way, and I'll be out of the way, because I like actually to listen. So the one way to think about what we're going to do tonight is to remember that next week, Jews are going to sit down for the Seder for the first evening of Passover and going to ask a question, how is this night different from all the other nights? And how is this dialogue different from all the other dialogues? And the analog is that in the past we used to try to have the full range of opinions. We don't do that tonight. We don't have anybody here, as far as I know, who thinks everything is hunky-dory, that we need 4 more years of the same, that the country is in the right place. Those people are not here tonight. So if you consider it unfair, please come back next week. We do have people from the center to the left, or like I like to put it in 2 bookends, almost caricatures, with all kind of positions in between. And on the one hand, to put it in a simplistic, extreme form, there are people who feel that if we just get a majority of progressive democratic people in Congress, the right kind of president, we'll be able to clean all the mess and attend to the many serious issues we have. Nobody's claiming that we don't face serious challenges, but the main way we could attend them is for electoral politics. There are other people who feel that the country is in deep trouble, and this is a point where we need much more than elect the right kind of people. This is a point of deflection, where we need to bring out major social changes in the economic structure, in the political structure, in the way power is distributed. And there are, we see on the one hand, just to give 2 examples, I'm going to ask the panel, so that it won't be only abstract. They'll say exactly what they want to say. There's no way I'm going to tell you what to say. But they agreed to, aside from whatever they want to share with us, address 2 specific examples, and they help me to think about this issue. And that is, what do we think about the Electoral College, and what we think about Medicare for all. So when you think about the Electoral College, there are at least 2 ways to think about that. If you are a very moderate person, you think that's about the last thing you want to mention. Why? Because there's no way on hell we're going to change Electoral College in the next 18 months. But raising it now will antagonize most the people who live in these rural states which have extra weight in the Electoral College. They will feel that you want to take away their power. So from a moderate viewpoint, it's about as poor an idea as you can come up with, nothing to gain, a lot to lose. On the other hand, if you look at the injustice of it all, the ever smaller number of Americans have extra power. By the way, largely people in white states have extra power over all the other states. You think, how can we not address such a major indignity and let that stand? And when you think about Medicare for all, you can think about it again in two ways. One, you can say, look, it's true that some 73% of Americans say they favor Medicare for all, but if you tell them that that entails taking away private insurance, which 70% of them love, and you tell them you have to pay for it, the supports the 23%. Why you want to go to a campaign where an issue which you can't even defend beyond the first two questions? Or you can say, even under Obamacare, we have 30 million people who are not insured. We call it affordable care, but there's nothing in Obamacare which makes it affordable. We can't go on and on like this. We need a radical reform. So I think I may have succeeded, I hope, in kind of the bookends of the conversation. Is it enough basically to do politics as usual, not to ignore the issues, but that's the way to go to them? Or do we remember that when the Democrat had a majority in the Senate and in the House, and had Obama in the White House, we still didn't get very far. So we're not going to do introduction because you have them in your brochure, and we will ask you to start, and then the rest of you are going to join the conversation, please.
There are more African Americans in the criminal legal process today than there were slaves in 1850. The average net worth of a white family is $170,000. The average net worth of a African American family is $17,000. Most African American kids are raised by a woman who was not married, a black woman who was not married. Her average net worth is $100. The wealth of the African American community, the disparity, the gap between black families and white families is growing. It's getting worse, not better. And it's getting worse in an era in which we've had Republican presidents and Democrat presidents, including the first African American president. The current political process fails African Americans. It fails to deliver racial justice. And we can talk about why that is. Some critical race theorists have a theory called democratic domination. To think about democratic domination, ask yourselves, why would poor white people vote for Donald Trump? Well, why would they vote for Republicans who favor the rich? They do that because they cling to the property value of their whiteness. Democratic domination is the idea that in order for a group that's a minority to achieve in a democratic process, it has to form coalitions with other groups. African Americans are so stigmatized that other groups resist these coalitions, including low-income white people. So, again, I think that we see extremely slow progress through the traditional electoral politics. It took 200 years for slavery to be outlawed. And as you know, even then it wasn't the ballot box that did it. It was the most bloody war in our history. Another 100 years for the old Jim Crow to be done away with, and that was more through the Supreme Court. I don't know how long it's going to take for the new Jim Crow, this massive apparatus that results in 1 in 3 young black men being in the criminal legal system. I don't know how long it's going to take before that travesty is abolished, but I know that African Americans can't wait that long. So you said that there are a lot of people here who are not supporters of Trump. I see a lot of white folks here, which means that you are atypical white people. No Democratic candidate ever gets the majority of the white vote. That was true of Clinton. She didn't get it. It was true of Obama. It was true of the previous President Clinton. And again, I don't think that's consistent with the best interest of the country. Maybe it's consistent with the best interest of some white people, some rich white people. And I guess the last stat is that if you look at the 400 richest families in the United States, the 400 richest families have more wealth than all of the African American families combined. And so I think that we should do away with the Electoral College. It's steeped in a history of slavery. If you look at the first 10 presidents, 9 out of 10 of those presidents were slave holders from Virginia. And the Electoral College, which goes hand in hand with the 3/5 clause, enabled that to happen. And again, I think that health care is a basic right for everybody, including people who come into this country without documents. So yes, I support health care for all.
Hi, I'm Elaine C. I've been in politics for many decades now, worked in the Clinton White House and taught at Harvard, and I'm now a Brookings scholar. Let me start with revolution or elections and just say, I want to combine them and say, we need a revolution in the way we do elections. That we have seen the resurgence in very, very clever and sometimes subtle ways of extreme voter suppression. We need to really stop that and fight against that. And I think even more recent than that is a new form of voter suppression. So we have the traditional ways of voter suppression, all the closing of polling places, etc. The new form comes over the internet. It comes in fake news. It came, in fact, in the last election from the Russians, where they targeted black communities to tell them that there was no difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. They made this look as if this were other African Americans promoting this. It was a massive fraud. And my guess, and it was fairly successful. Detroit, Wayne County had a drop-off of 70,000 votes between Obama 2012 and Hillary. Remember that Trump took Michigan by 10,000 votes. The same thing happened in Milwaukee. There was a huge drop-off between 2012 and 2016, and Trump took the state by less than that drop-off. I believe that this time around, we won't need the Russians to do that kind of voter suppression. I think the Republicans will be all over that kind of voter suppression, and it's harder to find. It's harder to track, it's harder to stop, it's harder to get your hands on. You can't go to court on it, and or not terribly easily. So I think we have to really be aware of what's happening on the internet with so many groups to try to subvert our elections. Medicare for all, great. I love Medicare for all. Democratic platforms have been for universal health care since Harry Truman's day. This is not some brand new thing for the Democratic Party. But as it was everything, the devil is in the details. So people who are 65 have worked all their life and contributed to the Medicare system. And then, and I think a lot of young people don't know this, when they sign up for Medicare, they pay premiums. They pay premiums, guys, okay? They pay premiums. Now, what if you're 24, you've only worked 2 years paying into the Medicare system, maybe you had a summer job and you paid, $5.60 into the Medicare system, and you get out and you want to sign up for Medicare for all, well, guess what? You're going to have to pay a premium. And then if you can't afford the premium, guess what? You'll go to Obamacare. That's what Obamacare is. It's premium support. So we come around, if you think this out, we come around in a great big circle. Yes, we should have universal health care, but whether this is the right way, and there's so many issues to be figured out here, And we can't suddenly dump the private healthcare system. If we were starting from scratch, absolutely, okay? We made a mistake back in the 40s. Roosevelt did it, by the way. We have the system we have because Roosevelt could not increase wages during the Second World War, okay, because there were caps on wages. So what companies did in order to attract people is they gave them health insurance. And so that was the way they got around the wage caps, and they provide. So out of Roosevelt, out of the Second World War, grows this enormous private health care system. The problem is 85% of Americans are in that system, and many of them complain about it until you take it away from them or threaten to take it away from them. Some of us lived through 1994 and Hillary Care. This is not as easy as it sounds, but the goal is great, and we should make sure that every American is covered. In doing so, let's remember that we're down to 8% uninsured in America. That's a tribute to President Obama, okay? That he moved the needle substantially on that, and we should keep working on it. Electoral college, absolutely get rid of it. And I'll tell you a story about the Civil War. So in the Civil War, you know, most of the generals who were of age to fight had all gone to West Point together. When the war broke out, they had to decide where they were going. Were they going to stay with the Union Army, or were they going to go with the Confederate Army? To a man, the Southerners went home and fought for the Confederacy. Now, what it tells you about the mindset of 1861-62 is that people in America then, and for many years before and after, thought of themselves as Virginians, or they thought of themselves as North Carolinians. They thought of themselves as New Yorkers. This America thing was pretty distant. The federal government was pretty small. This place was a total swamp, and nobody brought their families here because they'd get malaria. So, you know, you served in Congress in order to be able to go home and run for mayor or governor, a good job. Congress was not a good job for most of our history. Well, we're way beyond that, okay? We're 100 years beyond that. We are one country now. We move from state to state. We are one country. We are not 50 states. And it's time for us to elect a president as one country. And so, yes, let's get rid of the Electoral College.
All right, hello everyone, Ashanti Gholar. So I'm going to take a different approach here because we're talking about the Electoral College, we're talking about Medicare for All, and this is what happens when we get into a presidential election cycle. We just start to think up here, and we forget to think about down here, and how it's really the state and local elections that impact us every day, our everyday lives. We want to talk about the Electoral College. Do I think we should get rid of it? Yes, but that's a process. That is constitutional amendments. So if we want to get a constitutional amendment, then what do we have to do? We have to hold a majority of state legislatures. That happens at the local level. That happens with redistricting, which happens in 2020. It all starts at the local level. So we can't always just be thinking up here. It has to start with the everyday elections that most people don't care about. I'm not hearing about the fact that there's term limits in Louisiana. Louisiana is a state that is changing. So it's about holding those Democratic seats, but also which of those Republican seats can we flip. Another reason why people aren't talking about Louisiana is because it's Louisiana. It's the South. Who cares? Those people aren't like us. I know there are people who are like us. My organization, we have an affiliate in Louisiana. I went there in 2017. I was the only national Democratic organization playing on the ground because I was thinking ahead. That's something else we don't do. We like to play cycle to cycle, whereas Republicans, they're already 10, 15, 20 years ahead of us, and we wonder why we lose, because we're not being smart about it. We're only thinking in the here, in the now, not about how does this go, longevity. We need to start thinking about longevity. My friend talked about African Americans and the school to prison pipeline. We used to say that it started in the 3rd grade. Right now, for a lot of black kids, it starts in preschool. It starts in kindergarten. The women my organization elects are trained, and they get elected themselves. I'm not going to take credit for them. They run really great campaigns, get in trouble with some of our alums, but the legislation they introduce stops that. When we talk about the criminal justice system, 90% of prosecutors are white men. And we wonder why it looks the way that it does. Because you can't change the criminal justice system without changing the people that are the face of the criminal justice reform. So we have to start there. When we want to talk about voter suppression, that starts with secretaries of state. Stacey Abrams' race, I'm friends with her. I was very clear with people. They're going to have to steal that election. That's the only way they're going to be able to beat her. And that's exactly what they did. Now that man is governor. I refuse to call him by his name. But what is he continuing to do? He's continuing to suppress the vote ahead of the 2020 election when we know that our election systems are still being hacked, that there's still problems. We want to talk about Medicare for all and health care. For some people, that's way over their heads. They just want to know, when am I going to get a doctor in my community? How am I even going to access this health care? We have to get back to basics. We can't just be wanting to do these huge revolutionary reform ideas. It's the bread and butter issues. How am I going to pay my bill? Is my kid going to get a good education? How do I retire? You're giving me health care, but okay, I don't even have a bus that can take me to where the health care clinic is. This is what these conversations have to be about. We can't talk about the electoral college if we don't get out there and vote so that we have the majority that can even change it to eliminate it, and we can't give people Medicare for all if there isn't even the systems in place in their community to provide them that health care. Not even going to get into the discrepancies that happen with women of color in health care, because we know about the maternal mortality rate, all of that for black women. So that's what these conversations really need to be about. Is how do we start transforming people's lives at the everyday level so we can get them to want to talk about the electoral college and Medicare for all.
Thanks, Ashanti. So I'm David. I work with Our Revolution, and Ashanti and I were actually talking about both being political directors and before we came up here. And what's interesting for us is we both have different kind of roles, but they're not traditional political director roles. And so what's interesting for me is I do electoral politics, but it's not actually what I think is the most important thing in society. And I came from a family that really trade union family that really saw the importance of social movements. And so I very much, even though I come from a Sanders organization and I see the kind of like how he gets put on a pedestal, I very much do political education around why candidates are just one part of the puzzle. And so for us, we call it the triangle. So the triangle is we organize our groups and members around issues on one side of the triangle, candidates, and also changing the Democratic Party. So I'm just going to focus on the first two, because I think that what we've talked about here is really important, and I really want to build off what Ashanti said, is that one thing I always tell our members is Sanders was mayor first, and that Our Revolution has has taken in an influx of people who are really newly politicized, and see folks like Bernie, see people like Ocasio-Cortez, who reach these federal positions very quickly and take up all the media narrative, kind of building off, and they don't see, especially removing AOC for a second, that Bernie was mayor for 8 years, barely won his first race, had to build a coalition to do, and he would not have been a congressperson, he would not have been a senator, he certainly wouldn't be a presidential candidate, had he not actually served people in Burlington well and really built something around there. And that what inspires me about him moving is that he does say, and I think he believes, and it gets lost, is that you really need people in motion to pass change. You really do need, politics begins when there are millions of people fighting for something, and he kind of echoes this, and that we're not going to have Medicare for all, and he's very clear about this, unless there are millions of people actually demanding that, building a social movement, convincing trade unions, who no one mentioned actually some of the secretly biggest opponents of Medicare for all, because providing union health care is a huge benefit. I got great union health care as a child. I didn't know about copays. My father worked for the healthcare workers union. That's a huge incentive for unions to justify their membership. You have to build a movement that convinces labor not only to join that, not only to deal with capital. And so I think that the professor brought up a lot of good points where the devil's in the details about healthcare, so I won't do that besides my social movement. I also will just gently remind the devil's in the details about the Electoral College. And one thing, I'm certainly against the Electoral College, but there is, for some people, a perverse incentive of having only a few battleground states. In the sense that when I was a college student, I got sent to Pennsylvania. I just knock on doors in Pennsylvania. You don't have to worry about the Union and the Democrats. Don't have to worry about New York. You don't have to worry about California. You don't have to worry about Texas. Those are huge states that you don't have to worry about. So I do think there's something to think about too, in that there may be pushback when we get to there, in the same way there's going to be pushback on healthcare, in the way the devil's in the details about the Electoral College. And I think that there's also what my deep concern is, and I think that's why I was glad people brought up alternatives, is the Koch brothers and other folks would love a constitutional convention. Oh, you want to talk about the Electoral College? Let's talk about it. Let's have a constitutional convention and put everything on the table. Why don't we have right-to-work legislation in the Constitution, like we have in some states? Those are things that we as a movement have to grapple with, that are like, that's why I'm really glad Elaine said it, the devil is in the details. And these are not, it's very easy to think on this and be like, things are black and white, but even I, as someone who's like, coming from a very left-wing perspective, I recognize that policy implementation is not the prettiest thing.
Thanks. I'm John Cowan. So for 5 years, I worked right near this building. I was the chief of staff of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is right around the corner. This is gorgeous. HUD is ugly. But I say that not because this is first time I've been back in this neighborhood in a little while, but because HUD for me really captured the essence of this question, which is, it isn't either. It's not reform or revolution. It's not electoral politics or social movements. The entire history of this country, save the Civil War, which, as the professor noted, was a unique event, it has actually been the interplay of both. They work together. When they don't work together, neither one works properly. So if all you have is social movements, but that never actually translates into electoral politics, you have a social movement that doesn't create lasting policy change that affects people's lives. If you have only electoral victories, and all you do with your majority is tiny, tiny incremental things, school uniforms, well, what's the point of getting an electoral majority? What was the point of that? So I reject the premise that it is an either or. It is a both and. You have to do both. So at HUD, for example, HUD doesn't come to exist as an agency, literally does not come into existence, unless there's a civil rights movement demanding that the country do something about inner cities and how they're left behind. Demanding that the country doesn't say that the outcome of the Kerner Commission is simply more prisons, more cops. The outcome of the Kerner Commission is we invest in our communities. There is no HUD. Conversely, I sat on the front lines of HUD day in and day out. We have millions of Americans who have no place to live, can't afford where they live, and we fought tooth and nail simply to get 50,000 50,000 more housing vouchers. Now, Andrew Cuomo was the HUD secretary at the time. This was hand and fist fighting with Republicans to get 50,000 new housing vouchers. Is that enough? No. Is that a drop in the bucket? Yes. But that was 50,000 more families that would then have a place to live. Did we need more of a social movement to press for more assistance in a lot of communities, to press for more justice in a lot of communities? Yes. But we then also have to be able to win majorities to take that movement and turn it into something real. So let's take the two examples. I'll take first Medicare for all. I'm not for Medicare for all as a substantive matter. I do not think actually we should go to Medicare for all for a long list of reasons. Starting with the one Elaine said, and although she may end up in a different place than I am, which is you can't pull the whole thing down and start over. You just can't. That's not going to happen. Not going to start the healthcare system from scratch over in the United States. So what do you do to make it better? Well, I happen to believe that Obamacare was a big step to make it better, but not remotely a necessary step. And so when you look back at the history of social policy legislation in the United States, what happens? We put down a big marker, and then we go back to it again, and again, and again, and again. So, I'll criticize both sides. There's a lot of members of Congress on the Democratic side who want to tinker with Obamacare. That's BS. We cannot do what we need to do by tinkering with Obamacare. And there's others who want to rip the whole thing down and start completely over. That is at best a total waste of time. It is at worst going to prevent us from getting majorities. So, Colorado. Colorado had a single-payer initiative on the ballot in 2016. How did it do? Did not do well. It was destroyed. It lost 79 to 21. It lost in Boulder. In Boulder. It's not going to happen. And in fact, what's going to happen is that the Democratic Party elects someone whose one of their top two ideas is Medicare for all. We will re-elect Donald Trump. We will re-elect Donald Trump. And you can dance around it. You can love Medicare for all. You can argue it till the cows come home. But right now, if that's what we do, Trump gets 4 more years. And I think that's a disaster for everything, certainly that I and many others care about. The Electoral College. Look, the professor's right. It is a vestige of a series of bad compromises, some of which we've overcome, some of which we have not. Shouldn't exist. I don't think we're going to get rid of it anytime soon. I just don't think that's going to happen. And if you got rid of it, you still have to get enough Senate seats to get anything through the Senate. Well, that's in those same low-density, mostly red states. So as an electoral matter, not as a movement matter, as an electoral matter, if you cannot figure out how to win in a bunch of places where you have a disadvantage in the Electoral College, you probably can't get anything meaningful passed anyways. So eliminate it? Sure. But you still have to figure out how to win in those places. Last point before I turn the mic back. I also think when you go back to my opening premise, which is it is not an either or, it is a both and. You need powerful social movements that can drive fundamental change in this country, and you need political parties, in this case, the political party of which I'm a part, the Democratic Party, that can win elections and translate that social movement energy into actual lasting policy change. You need both. However, I personally believe that right now there is one imperative, and that is to remove the current occupant of the White House. And if there is tension, as there always is, between electoral politics and movement politics, and God bless that tension, because it is necessary tension, it is like the gears of a car, of a bike, but if there is tension, We must resolve that tension in the next 18 months in favor of getting this guy out of the White House, because it will wreck everything many of us have built and many of our predecessors have built over the last few decades. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful, wonderful opening. And I'm going to, in a moment, ask for just one question of clarity. But I just want to add one small detail to the discussion. Reference was made to the importance of local politics. And there's an interesting connection between this and the issue we're discussing. It turns out there's one other way of changing the Electoral College, and that is if the states will commit themselves to instruct the electoral to reflect the majority in their state rather than, indeed already 8 states signed up. So there is an interesting connection and a little more hopeful way to think about it. So the one question I like to ask each of you very briefly to address, and then we'll bring the rest of you in, is like this. So the primaries are over, and Democratic candidate has been selected. She or he signed on 11 litmus tests to show her commitment to reform and revolution. She committed herself, or he, whatever, she or he committed himself to abolish the Electoral College, Medicare, reparation, and so way down the list. Now, she calls in you, and says, okay, it's what should I do tomorrow? Should I campaign, basically address mobilizing the base by focusing on these issues? Or do I realize I can't get even the Democratic Party to line up? And that's a sure way to do the election. So give me a no answer. What do you tell that person to do the next day after they have been nominated? Do you suggest to them maybe a fancy, like recently Macron in France, after he got clobbered, did a tour of the country in which he had a listening tour the way Hillary did at one point? Maybe that person should go to a listening tour and find out how these more progressive ideas play. Or do you say, come on, stick to the flag, this is what we really need? So give us a no answer, sir.
If you care about a woman's right to choose, for the next president, it's too late. That's done. That's done probably for the next 30 or 40 years with the majority in the Supreme Court, which, if it won't overturn Roe v. Wade by the letter, will certainly do so in spirit. If you think about the connections between local politics and what was described as this high-level national stuff, Supreme Court is hearing a case right now about how local voting districts are drawn. The Republicans don't play fair. So this very conservative court will decide this case in a way that will be harmful to people who are not in the top 1%. And that's a done deal for the next 30 or 40 years. You know, it's nice to be able to think about reform and transformation as working hand in hand. It's not always the case. Classic example is the death penalty. So there are a lot of people who think that it should be abolished. I happen to be one of those people. There are also people who are working on reform. And it's complicated. When the death penalty is reformed, then we get good results like people who commit crimes when they're children can't be killed by the government. People who commit crimes and they're intellectually disabled, they can't be killed by the government. So the death penalty is now fairer, which makes it harder to reform. So, again, I want to suggest that it's more complicated than it seems. So I would tell this new president to go bold, to go creative, in part based on what Mr. Cowan said. Man, I miss President Obama. I miss the people in his administration. And I think that the people who are working in HUD are much better than the people who are working in the Trump administration's HUD. During the Obama administration, during the time that his very smart, gifted people ran HUD, black home ownership declined. The wealth in African American homes declined. And I don't think it was because Mr. Cowan wasn't doing everything he could to try to increase wealth. I think that there were structural issues. The United States has the oldest constitution in the world. I think it's time for a refresh. I think it's time to be creative. I think it's time to be bold. I think it's time to be visionary. That's my heritage as an African American. That's our heritage as Americans.
I just want to be absolutely sure I hear you clearly. So, tell me if I'm wrong. You want to go for the longer run. You don't really think it's all about the next election. We need to put our markers down and lift the vision. Even much is already lost. So if you look at the longer game, that's the way to go.
Yes.
I tend to be very worried about the next election because I think that Trump is destructive in ways that go beyond policy towards housing, policy towards health care, his appointments to the court. I think he is the first president we've had who is an undemocratic, small d president. What worries me about Trump and why I think it's very important to defeat him is less his policy positions, which I don't like, but more his entire attitude towards the president. He is a demagogue, he is an authoritarian, and he would, if he was smart enough to figure out how, he would undermine democracy. The only good thing you can say about Trump is he's got a really short attention span, and therefore he can't even figure out ways to submit, for instance, a new libel law in Congress. He always talks about that, which would, of course, really undermine freedom of the press. He hasn't done it, okay, because he can't do these things. That's the only good thing you can say about the guy. So I see this in two stages, okay? I see a resurgent movement, social movement on the left. We see this in the number of liberals creeping up from 19% of the population to 24, 25% of the population. That's good. There's a resurgence on the left. I think this is generationally driven. I think that if we get to a point where we've got a Democratic president and Democratic Congress, then we're going to have some great big fights about what we mean by Medicare for all and how far we go on the death penalty and a lot of other issues. We'll hash them out internally in the Democratic Party. But if we let this guy stick around, okay, we will have diminished democratic norms of behavior in this country, and that we may not be able to get back. And so I would hope that people would see this in two stages. Stage one, get rid of the cancer that's in the White House. Stage two, figure out how we build a new progressive movement in the 21st century.
People ask me all the time, do I think Donald Trump can get reelected? And they get so mad at me when I say yes. And they're like, well, why, Ashanti? And I was like, because there are going to be people who will walk into that voting booth and they're going to say, is he sexist? Is he racist? Have we lost our standing in the world? Is the economy going to go to trash? Yes. They'll answer yes to all those things, but then they go back to them. But am I doing okay? Am I all right? Do I feel safe? Is my family good? Yes. And then that is what will drive them to vote for him again. So what we have to do is appeal to those people who are not doing okay, who know that they cannot survive another 4 years under this presidency. And it's people from all walks of life who are not doing well. That's what we have to talk about. So it's not just telling our Democratic nominee, okay, this is the big issue that you have to go big or go home on. It is a lot of issues, and it has to start with all the horrible things that he has done and talking about how they are going to roll them back and get our country back on track. So that's not just our domestic issues, that's our international issues as well. I literally wake up every morning and check Twitter because I'm curious to see if we're going to be at war with Australia, because that is just how crazy he is. And it's going to be hard, and it's going to take a lot of effort, but we have to appeal to people's better senses. And I know that's, people are like, oh, like the Democrat and being idealistic, but that is where we have to go back to, is that we have to look out for everyone in this country. If we submit to his mindset of it's just me, mine, I'm good, then who knows what we can even get after a Donald Trump. We're not going to get his base. Like, they are there, they ain't moving, he tweets at them every day, he feeds them what they want, which is why I disagree with trying to swing so many voters back. If that's what we're going to focus on, we're going to lose. What we need to focus on is this new American majority that exists, which is young people, it's people of color, and it's women. It's about building the new base of the Democratic Party and getting them to turn out, to appeal to those people. That's how we're going to win. I work in politics. There's all these consultants all the time who are like, but how do we get them back? We need to focus on them. We ain't getting them back. Like, they're good. They're happy. Even though the things that he do at the end of the day, like, it doesn't benefit them, like, they're straight because they feel like he's looking out for me and they're not looking out for me. So it's how do we appeal to those people who we are looking out for and get them to turn out and vote on Election Day. That's how we win.
No one wants to hold the mic. So I want to build off what everyone's been saying, in that I feel it's, I think Elaine was talking about it mostly, but everyone touched upon it. Like, there needs to be a continuation of if there's whatever Democrat takes the White House, if that happens, to really build democratic institutions, small d, democratic institutions. So I was privileged enough to be invited with 2 other pro-Sanders organizations to go talk to a socialist caucus in the European Parliament 2 weeks ago. And I think the most stark difference was that actually, despite the attitudes we have here about concern about Trump, we were actually the most hopeful in the room. It was depressing because the Europeans know that the far right, let alone the conservatives, are going to do incredibly well in the May elections. And I got a chance to go to Sweden too, and it's the same problems. They're suffering from fake news. They're losing the trade union vote to the far right for similar reasons, to the point that, I remember the Swedes were just like so frustrated because the far right was doing a lot of stuff Trump was doing, where they were saying, like, we're the true heirs to the Swedish social democratic tradition. We're the ones who defend your jobs. We're the ones who do this. Like, and it works. And I think what was fascinating was, and building off what the professor Paul said, is, hope is very important. And that I think that you can't underestimate, the need for us to build democratic institutions and push social movements on the basis of hope. And I always remember, for the brief time I tried to be a union organizer, reading this beautiful letter written by a worker on, like, 2009. And it was like, and she's like, well, I have the courage to fight for this union because President Obama is talking about change. And it was interesting for me because I could be very critical personally about Obama's efforts with the Employee Free Choice Act and things he did around labor. But on this grassroots level, it's something I just never forgot. He inspired this, he helped, she obviously had the union organizers and everything else, but it was the final thing to get her to sign the card and be a leader was hope. And I think that, so for me, what I see is not a legislative priority per se. For me, it goes back to the work I do. It's that we have these people in motion, especially new people, like Ashanti is talking about, who want to be part of the political process, and we can't demobilize that. And that, I'm not going to name names, but I've seen that so many times in history of, like, demobilizing forces, which I think ends up letting things happen, or telling people things will happen, just trust us, and we'll cut deals. And then you have to kind of keep people in motion. And that the thing I always push against in history, which is fascinating too, is, like, if you look at the Great Depression and the New Deal, there's always this narrative on the left, which I think is very which is somewhat true. It's like, you know, the New Deal was like largely, you know, taken from the Socialist Party of America's platform. That's somewhat true. But there were also Huey Long, the kind of senior citizen movement. You know, there were all these things in motion that were putting pressure on Roosevelt, and that's when you really get social change. It's like, it's not just one thing, but lots of things. And if people are demobilized, if they're told just trust, that's when they get disappointed. So that's where I would be kind of focusing, and that's what I would think like an our revolution would do. And I'll just conclude on like, somebody asked me once, they were like, what would we do to hold, if Bernie becomes president, what would we do to hold like Bernie accountable? I was like, you build organizations. Like what you're doing, you build our revolution, you'll build the Democratic Socialist of America chapter, you'll do an indivisible chapter. You will just be part of the movement because in the end it doesn't matter who holds the White House if there's nothing to govern, if there's no people who are actually interested in passing a social policy or changing anything.
So if the nominee, the Democratic nominee, called me, and I'll be honest, if the nominee is Bernie Sanders, he won't be calling me. But if the nominee called me, first thing I'd say is you better call someone else, because I thought Hillary was going to win up until like 9 o'clock on election night. So what the hell do I know about getting rid of Donald Trump? But if they persisted, I would say that is a completely false choice between your base and your swing. Totally false choice. And whoever is telling you it's a choice, get rid of them as an advisor, because it's not true. You cannot win the White House. You can win a congressional district in deep blue America, mostly with the Democratic base. Not only, but mostly. You cannot win the White House. There is not precedent in the modern era for it. So a Democrat who wins 52, 53% of self-identified moderate voters, they don't win the White House. They have not won the White House in the modern era. Doesn't happen. Will not happen. So unfortunately, we have, as Democrats, because there are by definition, Elaine cited the stat, less self-identified liberals who tend to vote like 99% for the Democrat than self-identified conservatives who tend to vote like 99% for the Republican. We started a numerical disadvantage. Okay, we're going to start this election at a numerical disadvantage, even though the percentage of liberals is rising. Well, do the math. There are literally not enough people that if we only mobilize, you know, people who agree with us, us meaning if you take a more traditionally left position, there are not enough folks. There just are not. So you have to mobilize the base, the rising American electorate, the new American. You must do that. That's non-negotiable. You got to do it. But also remember, in American politics, it's not static. You mobilize more of your base, they'll mobilize more of their base. There's a ton of academic studies that show that, so it's not happening in a vacuum. Okay, we have to mobilize our base, both to win, but because we should. These are people who are core Democrats, who share our values, who are progressive. We should get them participating in politics. But you also have to reach people, and that's going to mean some of the people who are Obama to Trump voters. Obama to Trump voters, we have to win a percentage of them back. The media really conflates this. They make it sound like we have to win back most Trump voters. Well, we don't, and we can't. They're not going to come back, right? Most Trump voters. But most Trump voters didn't vote for Democrats anyways. We don't even have to win back all Obama to Trump voters. We have to win back a relatively small percentage in strategic places of Obama to Trump voters. But mind you, we have to win some of those voters back. Now, in the midterms, what happened in the midterms? Now, midterms are not a perfect proxy for a presidential election for a whole bunch of reasons. They're congressional races, you don't have the electoral college, et cetera, et cetera. But what happened in the midterms? Why does Donald Trump have a check on his presidency in the form of Nancy Pelosi in a Democratic House? Why? Because we ran mostly moderate or mainstream candidates on a strategy of base and swing in red and purple congressional districts, and we won. That's not an opinion. That is the fact. That's actually what happened. And why did that happen? It happened because we were able to both mobilize many Democratic voters and pull over voters who were Obama to Trump voters, soft Republicans, swing independents. We're going to have to replicate that. Now, you can completely mess that up. You can totally ignore your base, right? Which, by the way, I think Hillary did a lot of in a lot of places. Oh, and by the way, you can really insult the voters you need to bring over. So I happen to have liked Hillary. I worked in the Clinton administration. What did she do? She mostly ignored mobilizing the base in key places. Oh, and then she called everyone else we had to win deplorable. It would be hard to devise a worse strategy. It would be difficult to do. So it's not easy. We start from a place of having to build a coalition that isn't easy to build and isn't easy to maintain, of people who don't all agree with each other from different ideological perspectives. That's what it is. I can't change that. That's the rules of the game we're playing. Maybe the rules will change over the next couple of decades, not the next couple of elections. The country will change for the better. Politics will change. Maybe we'll get rid of the Electoral College, a state set of agreements, and other things. But now we have to get rid of him. And that's going to mean we have got to build a coalition that is both base and swing. Last point on this. Last thing I'd say to the candidate is, I really hope you didn't take those 11 litmus tests as your positions. Because if you did, you already locked in the loss. You already locked in the loss. I'm not saying you have to say something bad about Sanders. I'm not saying you have to say what I think about Medicare for all, but you're in politics. You're not in a social movement. Figure this out. Figure it out so you don't drive away the people you actually need. Because, by the way, the name of the game is 50 plus 1, and we better get 50 plus 1 this time around, because otherwise I fear for our country.
Wow. So in a moment, please use this microphone to join the conversation. But I'm going to, for a moment, please indulge me, take off my hat as a moderator and make just one brief comment. I think we did not do justice to Donald Trump, because if you don't fully measure the calamity he is, then you don't see the implications for the issue we've been discussing. We heard that he's endangering democracy. He surely does. But he endangers everything else anybody cares about. The elementary decency. The Federal Reserve are one of our mainstays of our economic policy. The basic norms. What does it mean to instruct the head of a federal agency and tell him to commit crimes and promise him to have a pardon next day? How cynical, how abusive can you get? How can you maintain a free society if you're going to load the courts? By the way, to digress here for 1 second, again, my colleagues talk about having 14 members on the court to correct its current imbalance. You do that and elect Trump, you're going to have him appointing 4 more Supreme Court judges. All the things we talk about, in my judgment, depend on getting this guy out of there, because he undermines anything, if you care about gay rights or child toy protection, it doesn't matter. He undermines anything which is decent and important.
Okay. I've always been, is that too loud? I've always voted, but I've not really paid that much attention to politics up until 2016. But what I have been listening to now and watching is like all of this business about we've got to get Trump out of there. But when I think in terms of the state legislatures and all of the other legislatures, like you're saying, I think at some point in time the Democrats have to paint the whole entire Republican Party with Donald Trump, because it's not just Donald Trump. Like you say, Donald Trump doesn't have that much of an attention span to do the damage that he has done. Donald Trump is there as the figurehead to keep us all excited and interested, and you know, he's the thing to bat against. But it is the Republican Party that is doing a whole lot of this stuff at the department levels, in the government, and they're the ones that are enabling him. So I think at some point in time we have got to paint the entire Republican Party, but these are their values. It's not just Trump's values. These are the Republican peoples and the bases. That's what they value. That's what they would like us to be.
Thank you. I want to thank the entire panel for your insightful comments. I find it so refreshing to hear these views, and I really think you do justice to the phrase civil discourse, something that is seriously lacking in our nation right now. My comment is specifically directed to Professor Butler, and it's driven by the fact that I had the privilege of attending the law school at which you teach. And the very first lesson that I recall in contracts class was my professor, Professor Gordon, who looked at the class and said, remember, the only truly effective negotiation is one where both parties sit at the table, negotiate in earnest, and get up and believe at the end of that negotiation that each of them has secured something of critical importance to their side, to their position. I took that lesson to heart because when I look at the constituency of the Congress today, an overwhelming percentage of congressmen, congresswomen, and senators are trained as attorneys. And I feel that they've lost sight of that lesson of the importance of consideration, cooperation, collegiality, civil discourse. The phrase that we hear, and we hear this often on MSNBC when you're talking to political officials, is my colleagues across the aisle. I despise the aisle. If I were president, the first thing I would push for is eliminate the aisle and force Democrats to sit next to Republicans and begin a civil discourse. I also believe with Ashanti that you have to look at the basics level. We can't solve all of these problems overnight. But I also believe that Mr. Cowan is correct, that the first item of business is we've got to get our foot in the door. And that may mean that we have to sublimate some of the more progressive proposals in the interest of getting a candidate before the American people who can win this election and then continue the dialogue to take us more in a progressive direction. But if you start off with an ultra progressive plank, I think we're going to lose many of the voters that we need to attract to our side. Thank you.
Since you were mentioned, do you want to come back?
Great. Well, it's great to meet a fellow Hoya, so thank you for being here. I think the comments, the first two comments are related in a sense. So I agree that a lot of what people want to ascribe to Trump is actually Republican. So the Republicans were happy to support Trump's nominees to the Supreme Court, and they were the same kinds of people who other Republican presidents would have appointed. And so these are people who are not only against gay marriage, they're people who think that states, if they want, should be able to punish people who have consensual gay sex. They're people who, again, don't think that women should control their own health care. And so this is about values and fundamentally opposing values. And so in that sense, I think it's sometimes hard to compromise when people are on such different sides of basic moral issues. The compromise you mentioned, historically, when that's happened, it's been a compromise at the expense of African Americans. So that was the 3/5 clause, and you can trace that on down through history. And so when there's this idea that even if it's right, the most progressive views have to be held back or controlled in order to win a political consensus, the people who suffer from that are African Americans. And even now, this conversation seems based on the idea that the Obama administration 4 years ago, or the Sanders administration 4 years from now, is as good as it's going to get, or at minimum is a good place to start. That's a bad place for African Americans. And again, that's why I think we have to be bold, we have to be visionary. I think we have that ability as American people, and I think the time is now.
Thank you to the panel. My name is Suleiman Vasti. My book is coming out tomorrow. It's called Strategic Commitment to Ignorance. And, and with that commercial, my question is to Professor Butler. The facts you have mentioned of income disparity and other disparities, 90% of the Americans don't know. And they don't want to know. That's the worst part. And what has happened, who's to be blamed? Academia has become corporations, think tanks have become lobbyists, and media has become used car salespeople. So how do we correct that disease? Thanks.
Can we take one more question, please?
Oh, me?
Please.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate these civil dialogues, and I thank all of you for being here so we can listen to what you think. Now, I must say, I agree with the first two members of the audience. I agree with the lady who said that it's not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump is revolting, but it's the people who back him up with everything that have to be gotten rid of. And although I do agree with the second man that, yes, it seems that we cannot go socialist because even the people who might want to be with us, just the idea of socialism would put them off completely. I feel that we might have to go with, as you say, a moderate person. But then I come to what the gentleman said, that we aren't going to really achieve much that way, because once we get this moderate in, will he make the changes that we would like to at least have him start, him or her, you know? And one last thing is, the gentleman at the end, Mr. Cowan, you never used, you said you didn't agree with Obamacare or Medicare for all, but you never really told us why. Thank you very much.
Maybe go down
Sure.
quickly because there are a lot of other people.
Great. A couple of things. So I strongly support Obamacare, fought for it, strongly support it, and I think a lot more needs to be done to make it truly universal and significantly more affordable. I run a think tank. We actually have a bunch of ideas to do that. But I think Obamacare can and should be the foundation for universal, lower-cost insurance for the United States in the 21st century. Just real quick on a couple other things that were said. I do agree with the person who said, look, if we run a candidate on a platform that is too far left, we will lose. We will lose. I mean, the data is unequivocal about this. I subjected my staff to a horrible experiment. They had to watch 967 television ads that Democrats and Democratic-affiliated groups ran in the midterms in the general election, so just in the fall. The only ads that had anything about Medicare for all or single payer in them were run by people who lost their seats. All the other ads were people who wanted to do things to dramatically improve Obamacare as a way to get to universal coverage. That does not mean, I'm not saying that you can have a serious policy argument about whether Medicare for all would be better and believe in it passionately. I am saying there are electoral realities, and you've got to keep those in mind, or at least I think we should, especially in a moment where we have to get rid of this guy. One last quick point on this is, what happens if you get a so-called moderate in? Do they do enough? Well, you can never do enough through electoral politics. You can't. That's not what it's designed for. It's not to design the whole damn thing and then you go home. Sometimes you have, as Professor Butler's referenced, long-term, profound structural discrimination that is never adequately addressed through the courts, through electoral politics. It just isn't and must be. And sometimes you have things like healthcare that are complicated and you make big progress, but you don't get nearly far enough. I happen to believe that the best way for political parties to have robust arguments about what is the best policy outcome is to have that argument from the position of having the power to actually then go do whatever you decide is best.
Anybody else?
So I will agree with the first comment, because back in 2006, that midterm election, I don't know if anyone remembers, but the way we framed Republicans was with culture of corruption. That's what Governor Howard Dean said, then it trickled down, and then that is what resonated when we painted the whole party, like all of them, just like all of them. Like, it's the culture of corruption. Because it can't just be that one person. It has to be everything that is attached to it. And the second question I was asked, I do think this is something that we are going to hear a lot of just as voters, because people are divided. They do just want to win. So it's like, just give me the candidate that's going to win. But then you have those other people who are like, I want to win and I want them to do all of these things. So that's just going to be a battle between us as voters. And we'll see which side wins. So.
And if I could just... I have two mics. Thanks, Jonathan. So I just want to address...
Deliberately.
So I think no other way to say it. Like, I mean, I do believe that Sanders has a pathway to the White House, and it would be derelict of my duty not to articulate that. And I think that was really fascinating, just talking a little bit briefly about those two trips I did, is when sometimes you understand things better when somebody who's not in your space asks you about them. And so somebody from Sweden asked, why do you guys talk about Sweden so much? Why do you talk about Finland? And I thought about it, and I said, like, it's because we don't have the political vocabulary to really talk about social democracy in the United States. So we rely on welfare states as living examples, you know, to articulate. So that's what Sanders does. That's when people try to attack from the right, you know, about all immigration issues. You know, they use these examples. So I think that, you know, while I'm openly a socialist and I don't think that Sanders is running on socialism. I think that's a really good point that you brought up. I think, though, the ideas that are being expressed are much more social democratic and much more in tune with what Americans want. And I do, while I agree with Shanti 100%, and I've been at meetings where I'm like, you know, I think that Trump does have a real chance to win again. I do think that we're in a transformative moment where there's excitement for new ideas, like Professor Butler was saying, and I do feel that Sanders and if there's a united front, you know, against Trump, you know, that's possible. That's not, and in the spirit of civil dialogue, that's not taking away from what Jonathan's saying about, you know, doesn't mean Ocasio-Cortez can win in every district in the country. And but I don't think that but I think that there is genuine movement towards something different that we, even people like me who are, you know, only been in politics professionally for 10 years, haven't fully understood and grasped. And I'll leave it at that.
Let me just address Paul's first comment, because I think he brings up the central dilemma that, Amitai, you have framed so nicely here. The risk you take when you go big, right, in the big ideas, the big, bold ideas, the risk you take is that you lose and you go backwards. So the question we always end up with in an election is, all right, what's the safest route to take, right? Are we going to go with somebody, with the classic moderate Democrat who pulls in those Republican suburban women who were the key in giving us the House of Representatives in 2018? Do we go carefully so that we will make some progress and get rid of Trump and not go backwards? Or do we take the big leap into the future, right? And go take the big leap and try to jump over, change the paradigm, etc. I'm for the view of first do no harm, okay? I look at politics the way with the Hippocratic Oath. First do no harm. Don't let there be another Trump administration. Don't let there be another Republican Senate, because that takes us backwards. Even while I admit, as David and Paul have articulated, that, yeah, you know, there's a lot of appeal to that big leap into the future, to that big paradigm change. I don't think I would take that chance with particularly the most vulnerable people in society.
So next time we are going to discussion, I'm going to open it very shortly. I'm going to say, is it a leap into the future or is it a leap off the cliff?
A couple of questions that I have, and it revolves around health care. I vote against my own interests, and let me explain why. I had a medical procedure done last year. It cost $30,000. I paid about $300. I picked up a medication yesterday. It was free because my insurance company paid for it. I had another bill. It was $15. It was a discount of $78 down, you know, discount of $55, $15. So when they say 100% increase, 200% increase, give that to me, because I can pay $30 if it's 100% increase. I can pay $45 increase. So I think in some cases, some are taking total advantage of the healthcare system, such as myself, because I have good health benefits. But then I go out and buy my mother's prescription. It's $200. I'm trying to understand, why isn't it net balance where my insurance increases $100 to $200 to $45, and my mother's medical prescription go from $200 to $100? If you understand what I'm saying, please help me out. Why is insurance so imbalanced?
Excellent question. Let me just say here one thing. Earlier there was a question, do we need to write off all the Trump people? I'm not so sure that's correct. First of all, a fair number of them, not a small number, said they could just as easily voted for Sanders. So they're angry, and maybe for good reason, but I don't think we should write them off. Second, I think it's indecent. They're human beings, they're Americans. But most importantly, the issue we just raised, I think there is the profound common ground. What's happening on top of everything we heard so far is that concentration of economic power lets the corporation to allow insurers and big pharma and the banks and real estate associations to really harm all Americans. So if you want to talk about an economic story, which I think has purchase for people across the spectrum, is talk about how large corporations, by bribing Congress, get to do the things you mentioned, increase medication costs by 5,000%, and then when they criticize, they laugh their way to the bank, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, it ties to your issue, because people who suffer most from the corporate abuse are, of course, the minorities. You all guys get another chance, but let's have the last questions.
My name is Mike Golash. When I came here, I read the title, Reform or Revolution, and I thought the discussion was going to be, do we want to try and reform capitalism, a system based on racism and sexism and inequality, which allows a handful of people to become billionaires and millions of other people to live in poverty? Or are we going to try and change that fundamental system to a more cooperative, collective society where people work together, create wealth, and share it among themselves? And I don't see that discussion going on. I see the discussion simply as, let's shuffle the decks on the Titanic a little bit. Maybe things will get better for a few people and worse for some others. But fundamentally, those inequalities, that racism, that sexism, will continue with us. So I think the discussion has to be more broadly based what we're talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes. Hi, thank you. Ann Wilcox. I just wanted to mention, you talked a little bit about the European parties, but I think the Brexit debate was another example of the fact that the fear of economic insecurity, losing one's job, is something that is worldwide. And I think any candidate who runs for either party is going to have to address that. Trump is sort of a grotesque part of that, but he's not the underlying fear. And then I also want to mention with Professor Butler's agenda, sort of the reform efforts around ending cash bail and reformist local DAs who are sort of at least chipping away at some aspects of mass incarceration.
Thank you. Please, we need to take this last question because we have 5 minutes left. Sure. Please.
I'm Jacob.
No, please don't go away. Don't go away.
So just the short introduction is, even being 38 years old myself, I've been interested in electoral-related politics for 30 years. That's not inaccurate. Maybe some of you can relate. Anyway, so one of the things I've been noticing over the last number of years is, and in many cases it's on the exact same ballot where we've win on issues, minimum wage increases, in Florida, the constitutional amendment to allow former felons to vote, and yet these same people, and enough of them, then vote for politicians who have absolutely no desire to make any of that happen. So if you're looking for, I would say, a type of population to, help us out here, and that might be swingable, it's when the issue's in front of them, they'll do the right thing. When they're looking to who to vote to represent them, it's completely the opposite.
Thank you. One last question, please.
I chair the statewide Unitarian Universalist Legislative Ministry in Maryland. So I've been working in a blue state, a lot of progressive things happening, but there's still this structure that keeps a lot of good things from happening or happening well. They keep knocking down, watering down important measures. I'm concerned that if we don't go big, as the professor says, when are we going to transform ourselves into a society that cares about other people? We've got the world's worst example of the capitalistic, misogynistic patriarchy here. When are we going to mass enough people who can actually start changing minds and hearts and make some of the changes that are fundamental and revolutionary?
So we're going to go, each of you has one more chance, last words, beginning with you, but briefly, please. Last words.
Obviously, I fall into the reform, not revolution camp, and particularly in this moment. 3 quick things. But one big thing we have to reform is our entire electoral system. It is basically rigged so that it's incredibly difficult to vote. We don't have anything else like it in the country. It's easier to use your technology, et cetera, than it is to vote. We really need reform on that. Second is, I just want to speak up as kind of the moderate on the panel, if you will. It is not acceptable if we get a moderate president that they do a bunch of silly small ball things. That's not what the moment calls for. You don't have to believe in democratic socialism to believe the country also needs to do big things to reform capitalism. So one simple example, free college actually is highly regressive. It is people who have less money, who don't generally go to college or want to go to college, or think they need to go to college, paying for people who do. How about we have a national apprenticeship system that is at the same scale of our public university system that we spent the last century developing, that would serve a hell of a lot more people at a much lower cost. Last point, very practical one. We ran 2 people in the modern era for president who were very far left compared to their time, McGovern and Mondale. They got like 13 or 15 electoral college votes each, something like that. Obama and Clinton, who I know folks think are too moderate, they crushed it. Let's crush it.
So just because I know we don't have a lot of time, I think that one aspect that I know Mike brought up, who's the speaker, talked about reform and revolution, is that he taught me at a reading group was that, some of the most transformative moments in history have come with very basic demands, and that it's important to remember the Russian Revolution had peace, land, and Brit, and that it's when people don't get those, then you actually have incredibly, probably, and this is where Mike and I would probably disagree, then really bad results. And that I think that we need to push for transformative demands, and I do disagree with Jonathan's analysis on college for all and some other things, but that's not the most important point. And I think what I think is more important is that there needs to be something where we really are pushing to take a lot of what is currently in the market out of the market, and I think that's what Sanders and Warren, to a certain extent, and others are starting to push. And I think that Obamacare, in certain ways, was touching upon that, but wasn't enough, and that there just has to be, we have to move to a society where there are certain things that are just really social goods, and I think that's just critical, and that's ultimately what I think is the most important thing.
Right, so for me, taking the last question, the gentleman, I don't know where you went, but he talked about living in Maryland, a blue state, things should be like progressive. I think that's part of what we have to change in our mind, having blue states, having red states, having purple states. We just need to forget all of that because none of them really exist at the end of the day. We have to continue to elect people that represent our values and will make the change that we want to see, period. Perfect example in Oregon. People consider it a blue state. They have the supermajority in the state house, and they continue to add to it because the fact is Republicans constantly play in Oregon to find cracks. It's always their testing ground because they feel if we can get this passed in Oregon, a super progressive liberal state, then we can get this passed in other states. That's why we can never take our eye off of the ball and get comfortable with I live in a blue state, I live in a progressive state, I have great representation. Because again, they're 10, 15, 20 years ahead of us, and we're still like, oh, yay, 2020. So keeping our eye on the ball and really start thinking long-term and realizing we have to continue to make these gains.
As you've probably figured out, I'm also in the reform, not the revolution camp, okay? And I'll just say, be careful. If you fail in the revolution, you go backwards. If you fail, people you most care about will lose things. I've seen it time and time again. I'm old enough to have lived through the Reagan Revolution, okay? That didn't work out so well for people that Paul cares about, people that we care about. You got to be careful here. You just got to be careful here. If you think you're going to throw the long pass, okay, you got to be sure that everything's lined up. I don't see it, all right? I don't see it. I can imagine situations where you would see it. I don't see it today, and I think when you talk revolution in America 2019, you're playing with fire, you're running the risk that you're going to hurt some very vulnerable people if you fail, and I think you will.
And the very vulnerable people who I care about are African American people, they're Latinx people, they're undocumented people, and there have never been a good old days for those folks. It's true that the Trump administration hasn't worked out well for them, but respectfully, neither did the Obama administration. So I'm remembering the feminist maxim that women who seek to be equal to men lack ambition. Democrats who seek to be equal to Republicans lack ambition. I think that, again, we have to be bold. We have to think about this wonderful parade that the audience didn't see, but we got to see a few minutes ago of hundreds and hundreds of children walking by. And they were diverse, they were beautiful, they're our future. And if, when they're our age, they're sitting here talking about whether it's going to be a blue state, red state, Democrat or Republican, but black people are still on the bottom, Latinx people are still on the bottom, undocumented people still are on the bottom. We have not given them the kinds of values, we have not accepted the kind of civic responsibility that we need to transform the world, to make it a better place for those children.
Please just hold your applause for 1 minute before we thank to a panel, which was really exactly the kind of conversation we were hoping for. I just want to invite you all to join us to the last dialogue in this academic year, which is going to be in May. It's going to be on the First Amendment, and we're going to ask similar profound questions. Is it a time to revisit the First Amendment? Should we curb hate speech? Should we prevent people from creating fake accounts? All the kind of things you hear. What should we do with Facebook? All these questions. Please join us in May for that discussion. But tonight, I believe it really was an exceptionally valuable dialogue. Please help me thank all our panelists.